Guys, Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, back in 2023, we got the release of Season 1 of Dragon's Rising. However, prior to that, we got the release of a book, Quest for the Lost Powers. This is essentially meant to act as a sort of epilogue when it came to the original Ninjago show, taking place after the events of Crystallize and detailing how the original four ninja got their powers back after losing them at the end of the Crystallize finale. And it's something that I do think is really interesting, essentially seeing this one last adventure for the original four ninja prior to the next era of Ninjago starting. And even though it's been a few years since this book came out, I still want to cover it as I do think it is genuinely really interesting. So, let's get into this whole thing. So, the book starts off with some narration from Sensei Wu, essentially giving us a small recap when it came to things that happened during the events of Crystallize, primarily with the original four ninja losing their powers. And we find out that when it comes to the four ninja, each of them ended up taking different paths in order to regain their powers. And this is something that they were able to do. We saw that during Dragon's Rising, they had their powers back. And this book, again, is meant to explain how the team actually did end up getting their powers back. And when it comes to these various stories, they are all essentially told from Sensei Wu's perspective, with him explaining things to us, the reader. So let's actually get into these stories and see what happens with them, starting off with our first story, Kai, which, I'm going to be honest, I do think that Kai's story is by far the weakest out of all these, and I don't think it's that great. However, I also think it's the only one of these stories that is actually weak, because for the rest of the team, their stories are all pretty good, honestly. So, starting off with Kai's story, we see him at Chen's noodle house spending some time with Skylar, where we learn that Kai has basically given up on the idea of being a ninja. He thinks that since he doesn't have his powers, he can't really be a hero or do anything in order to protect people. And he thinks that when it comes to the police force of Ninjago, they can do a better job at helping people than he can. Skylar ends up calling Kai out on this, saying that he can still be a hero, but Kai is really insistent that he can't be a hero anymore, given that he doesn't have his powers. And we see that when it comes to Kai, he isn't that great at being a hero anymore. When a group of rabbit-themed criminals end up breaking into the noodle house, Kai tries to fight against them, and he isn't that successful, meanwhile Skylar is. So Kai isn't doing too well. That is until him and Skylar hear news about Firefang, which is the gigantic snake that Asphira used during the events of Season 11. And Kai thinks that if he can find Firefang and defeat Firefang, he might be able to get his powers back, because Asphira used his stolen powers in order to create Firefang in the first place. So him and Skylar the next day end up heading out in order to try and find Firefang. The two of them end up coming across this village that's constantly attacked by worshippers of Firefang, a gang known as the Fire Fiends, who end up attacking the village. Kai and Skylar do their best in order to fight against the Fire Fiends, and they're ultimately able to defeat them. The two of them then proceed to make their way to the Fire Fiends' base of operation in hopes of finding Firefang. And here we end up getting something that we see with Kai throughout the story, and that's him being really mean to Skylar. Like, Kai throughout this story is really mean to Skylar and is always insisting that he can do things on his own and he doesn't need help when it comes to fighting against Firefang and doing all this stuff. He believes that he can do all this stuff on his own, even though he knows that he can't do this. And this is something that is kind of weird, but this does end up fitting into Kai's story when it comes to this section of the book. Right, but I'm going to get into this more later. So anyway, Kai eventually ends up finding Firefang as well as the rest of the Fire Fiends, and Kai does what he can in order to fight back against them. However, he's barely able to do anything. That is until Skylar shows up, and by working together, the two of them are able to successfully fight back against the Fire Fiends and Firefang. And when it comes to Kai, he realizes that it's okay for him to rely on others, and he doesn't always have to do everything on his own, thus allowing for him to unlock his elemental powers again, and by working together, him and Skylar are ultimately able to defeat Firefang once and for all. And so with that, the day is saved, and the two of them head back to Ninjago City, and the story for Kai ends revealing that after all this time, him and Skylar have now officially become a couple. And then Dragon's Rising happened, the merge basically got rid of Skylar right off the bat, and according to the writers, we don't want an update surrounding Kai and Skylar's relationship, suggesting something bad might have happened between the two of them. So, yeah, that's Kai's story, and overall when it comes to this, again, I do think it is the weakest out of all these stories, and it's for one major reason. This entire story for Kai is basically just his season 11 arc all over again, except not as good. I talked about this a few times in the past, but I honestly really like Kai's powerless arc from season 11. I think it's a genuinely good storyline that he got during that season, revolving around him losing his powers and him coming to the realization that he doesn't need his powers in order to be a hero, and it's okay for him to rely on others as well as himself in order to get himself out of tough situations, even when he does have his powers. It's something that I do think is really interesting, and yet this story basically just does that all over again, except here it doesn't work overall. You see, when it comes to Kai, when it came to him acting the way he did during season 11, it made sense because he was the only member of the team who lost his powers. So it made sense that he was being really hard on himself, and he felt like he couldn't do that much in order to help out everyone else because the rest of the team could. Here, though, all four of the original ninja did lose their powers, so a bunch of them are in the same position, and yet Kai still feels like he can't do anything. Which doesn't make any sense, especially since in Prime Empire, all the members of the team lost their powers in the game, and we saw that Kai was still optimistic about things, because he learned from the events of Season 11. So him acting this way doesn't really make a lot of sense when you think about it. Not to mention there's also him being, again, kind of unnecessarily mean to Skylar. Like, it fits into the idea of the story with Kai realizing that it's okay to rely on others. But when it comes to Kai, again, it just feels really weird seeing him act this way towards Skylar. Especially since Kai's never really done anything like this. There were some moments during Season 4 where he wasn't the nicest to Skylar, but it was after the reveal of her working alongside Chen, so it made sense. Here it just comes off as feeling really weird, and overall when it comes to the story again, I honestly don't think it's that good, and again, the biggest reason why, this is basically just Kai's Season 11 arc all over again, except bad. So after this, we then have Zane's story, which is honestly my favorite story in the entire book. Not just because Zane is my favorite ninja, but also because the story itself is genuinely really good, and it also does something that fans have been demanding to see with Zane for a really long time, and I think it's honestly really great. However, I feel like Zane's story also showcases by far the biggest problem with this book, but I'm gonna get into that. So, when it comes to Zane, we see him and Pixel at the Samurai X cave, with Zane thinking that if he can tap into his memories, he might be able to find some way to unlock his elemental powers again. And Pixel is standing by working all the technical stuff as well as being there to support Zane. So Zane ends up going into his memories, and we end up seeing some flashbacks of stuff from across the show. Like Zane's first memory, for example, is him having his existential crisis back during Season 4, when he wasn't sure about whether or not him being in a new body meant that he was still the same Zane or a different one. And of course, Zane comes to the realization that even though he is in a new body, he's still the same Zane, and he's able to accept his identity as a Titanium Ninja, thus allowing for him to unlock his dragon power, which is something that is pretty cool. Then, in another memory, Zane ends up in a forest of birch trees, and he realizes that this memory has to do with his creator, Dr. Julian. Specifically, though, this is Dr. Julian's death, where we see him lying on a bed next to Zane, and Dr. Julian ends up turning off Zane's memory switch. And we see that Zane is pretty upset at Dr. Julian for doing this, and he tries to do something to prevent this from happening, which is something that I do like, as we did see Zane reflecting on this during the events of Crystallized. However, because this is a memory, Zane can't do anything about it. So past Zane ends up losing his memories, and present Zane is distraught by this. We then end up fast forwarding a little bit, where we actually see something brand new for the first time. Specifically, we see Zane, after he lost his memories, helping some people who are in danger because of a tree horn, those gigantic monsters that we saw during the episode TikTok. Zane is able to fight back against the tree horns and get those people to safety, thus fulfilling what he was programmed to do, protect those who cannot protect themselves. So things are going well, however, things end up changing when it comes to the next, and by extension, the last major memory that Zane ends up having, and that is of him as the Ice Emperor. That's right, this story gives us a proper conclusion to the Ice Emperor story, and it is genuinely really good. So we end up getting a flashback to the first time we ever saw the Ice Emperor back during the events of Season 11, back when Vex informed him about the ninja showing up in the Neverrealm in the first place. And Zane is understandably really upset at seeing himself as the Ice Emperor again and seeing what he was like when he was doing all this stuff. And he ends up calling out the Ice Emperor on doing this stuff, and the Ice Emperor actually responds. Unlike in the previous memories where Zane couldn't properly interact with anything, the Ice Emperor does notice Zane and he tries to fight against him. Luckily though, Pixel is able to pull Zane out of the memory before anything happens, and Zane is understandably really traumatized at having to relive this moment of his life as the Ice Emperor. However, Zane figures that he has to fight back against the Ice Emperor in order to overcome this trauma and finally work through it. So Pixel sends him back into his memories, where Zane and the Ice Emperor fight against one another. And it is a pretty hard fight, and it looks like the Ice Emperor is going to end up getting the upper hand at some point. That is until Zane realizes something. He remembers something that we didn't see on the screen, but it's something that I still think is interesting, where apparently Vex ended up informing the Ice Emperor about a fishing village that wouldn't pay him any tribute, and the Ice Emperor initially didn't want to do anything about it. However, because of Vex's influence and the Scroll's corruption, the Ice Emperor ultimately decided to go along with what Vex wanted, and this in turn causes Zane to realize something really big. The entire time he was the Ice Emperor, he was fighting back against Vex's influence and the Scroll's corruption. It's something that was really hard for him to do, but he was still there the entire time. He was still Zane, and thanks to this newfound realization, Zane is ultimately able to gain the strength that he needs in order to properly fight back against the Ice Emperor, ultimately being able to disarm him and remove the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu from his grasp and re-unlock his elemental powers. Not only that, but Zane is also ultimately able to forgive the Ice Emperor for what he did, with Zane coming to the realization that even though he did do all that bad stuff, that doesn't change anything about who he is nowadays, and he's doing what he can in order to make up for that horrible stuff that he did. And thanks to Zane doing that, he is ultimately able to defeat the Ice Emperor once and for all, finally being able to fully overcome that trauma that he had gone through, and thus all is well. And overall, again, I think the story is one that's genuinely really great to see. We end up seeing Zane going back into his memories, seeing some familiar moments from the show, which I think is really cool. And again, we end up getting a proper conclusion to the Ice Emperor story, and I honestly think it is really good. We actually see this book addressing the trauma associated with Zane being the Ice Emperor, and we see him doing what he can in order to face and ultimately overcome that trauma, with Zane being able to face his past, but not letting that determine what his future is going to be. It's something that I do think is genuinely really good, and overall, again, I think that Zane's story is by far the best out of all of these. However, like I said, I feel like Zane's story also showcases the biggest problem with this book, and it's that when it comes to these stories, they are relegated to just being in this book. And because of that, not every Ninjago fan is going to read or even be aware of this. When it comes to these stories, again, they are relegated to just being in this book, and that's it. And given how the show so far hasn't really done anything to actually address the events of this book, again, not everyone's gonna know about this stuff. Even though we do learn how the ninja got their powers back, and we finally get the conclusion to the Ice Emperor story, not everyone is gonna know about that. I have seen multiple Ninjago fans claim that the Ice Emperor story never got a proper conclusion, even though there is one present in this book. Again, not everyone read it or knew about it, because there are some genuinely really good stories in this book, and I think it's honestly a shame that not every fan is going to be aware of that. Moving on, we then have Cole's story. Cole's story starts off with his father, Lou, looking for Cole. We learn that following the events of Crystallize and him losing his powers, Cole ended up wandering around for a bit before eventually ending up as a farmer, with him helping out a bunch of other farmers. We see that overall things for Cole are pretty good. He's helping out these farmers, and so far things for him are going pretty well, with him being happy. That is, except for an evil farmer known as Takanagi, I probably mispronounced that and I'm sorry if I did, who's apparently trying to take the land of Cole's farmer friends. Something that no one wants, and Cole has been doing a lot in order to fight back against Takanagi and his forces of war tractors. And we see that when it comes to Cole, he's putting a lot of pressure on himself in order to do this, primarily due to that promise that he made to Lily all those years ago. And Lou realizes that when it comes to Cole, this isn't the best thing overall. It's definitely good that he's helping out these people, but also Cole pushing himself isn't a good thing either. And he tries to get through to Cole, but it doesn't work that well. That is until he brings up Cole's mom, Lily, where we learn that when it comes to Lily, she also used to push herself a lot, and that wasn't the best for her. However, thanks to her spending time with Cole and Lou, she was ultimately able to find balance in herself, and she was able to remain grounded. And this is something that does end up helping out Cole. Eventually, though, the evil farmers end up attacking, and once again, Cole does what he can in order to fight back against them. Things don't go too well, however, the rest of the farmers end up joining in and they're able to help out Cole, which does help out for a bit. However, things end up getting worse when it comes to the battle, and Cole is insistent on having all the other farmers flee, leaving him to be the one to do all this. However, the farmers, as well as Lou, decide not to do that, and they decide to stand up and fight alongside Cole no matter what. And as a result of this, Cole is ultimately able to unlock his elemental powers again, realizing that he doesn't always have to put so much pressure on himself. He doesn't always have to do everything on his own. And Cole is ultimately able to fight back against the farmers, and he's able to defeat them, and him and Lou end up going back to Ninjago City when all is said and done. Overall, I'd say this is another pretty solid story that we ended up getting. I don't think it's as great as Zane's story, but it's something that I still think is pretty solid, and I feel like the stuff that we do get with Cole in this story is overall pretty good. I also think that when it comes to the story, this is what the book was trying to do with Kai, with the whole idea that you don't have to do everything on your own and it's okay to rely on others. But I feel like for Cole, it definitely works better given the context of his character when it comes to not just this book, but really him in general when it comes to the franchise, and how he usually puts a lot of pressure on himself in general to do things on his own. And I feel like it's something that does honestly work pretty well here. And again, overall, when it comes to this story for Cole, I think it is honestly pretty solid. And finally, rounding out the stories, we have Jay, who I think also honestly gets a genuinely good story in this book. So when it comes to Jay, we learned that him and Nia have apparently gone to an island resort in order to spend some time relaxing after everything that's happened. And while Nia is definitely looking forward to this, Jay, by comparison, isn't as excited, primarily because Jay has a lot of stuff on his mind, primarily stuff related to his birth mom, because Jay's been thinking a lot about her, specifically about how he never really got the chance to know her, and he's wondering if because of that he potentially missed out on some things growing up. So Jay ends up going out into the jungle in order to try and clear his mind. However, Jay ends up getting lost there until he ends up running into Unagami, surprisingly. Yeah, he's in this book. And we learned that when it comes to Unagami, he's apparently doing research for a new video game that he's working on, and he's trying to find an ancient city that's apparently located somewhere on the island. So him and Jay end up teaming up in order to try and find it. And we learned that when it comes to Unagami, things between him and Milton Dyer have gone really well. The two of them have been communicating a lot, and the two of them have been able to work on their father and son connection. And that's something that Unagami is really happy about. And this is something about the story that I think is genuinely really interesting, because what we get with Jay and Unagami is basically a reverse of what we saw with the two of them during the events of Prime Empire. This is something that I brought up a few times, but something that I think is interesting is that in Prime Empire, we see that when it comes to Jay, he was able to make peace with the fact that his parents abandoned him, and although he does have questions, he was ultimately able to come to terms with his parents' decision to abandon him. Something that Unagami was never able to do, thus resulting in him getting really angry at Milton Dyer and wanting to try and find some way to get out of Prime Empire in order to confront him. And we see that when it comes to Unagami, he represents a version of Jay that could have been created if Jay didn't come to terms with what happened with his parents. Meanwhile, Jay represents what Unagami would ultimately become when he and Milton Dyer were able to work through their issues. Meanwhile, this time around, we get a reverse of that, where Unagami is the one who's come to terms with things when it comes to his parents, or parents rather. Meanwhile, when it comes to Jay, he's the one who's unsure of things, which is something that I do think is genuinely really interesting. The two of them end up doing some more exploring, where they eventually end up finding the ruins of the ancient civilization. The two of them end up going down a staircase, where they end up finding a library of an ancient tribe that apparently lived on this island. Unagami ends up finding some scrolls, specifically one revolving around raising children, and how apparently everyone in the village took part in raising a child. It wasn't just the child's parents who did that. And this in turn ends up causing Jay to realize something. And it's that when it came to everyone in his life, like Ed and Edna, the ninja, Sensei Wu, all of them were able to help Jay, and they were able to help turn him into the person who he is now. Jay realizes that when it came to all these important people in his life, they were able to help him out the same way two parents might be able to do so for a kid, causing Jay to realize that even though he didn't have a proper biological family growing up, he did still have a family regardless. And thanks to that, Jay is actually able to unlock his elemental powers. which is something that's definitely great. However, an earthquake ends up starting, so he and Unagami do what they can in order to escape, eventually being able to get out of the ruins. And the two of them are definitely relieved when they are eventually able to get out, and the two of them end up running into Nia, who, as it turns out, ended up placing a tracking device on Jay before he left the hotel. However, all is well. Jay, Unagami, and Nia end up going back to the hotel, and we see that when it comes to Jay and Unagami, the two of them now view themselves as brothers after everything that has happened. Once again, I think this is honestly a really good story that we ended up getting when it came to this book. It does something interesting with Jay by actually addressing stuff when it comes to his biological parents, specifically his mom, which is something that we haven't really seen the show do that much. So I think it is honestly really cool that we actually get the chance to see that. And I really like how this book expands on the dynamic that we saw between Jay and Unagami during the events of Prime Empire. It's something that I think is honestly really cool to see, and again, I think this is honestly another genuinely good story that we ended up getting from this book. And so with that, the story ultimately comes to an end, with Sensei Wu giving us a recap on stuff that ended up happening with all the four ninja and how they were ultimately able to regain their elemental powers. And he invites the reader to come back at some point if they ever want to learn more things about the ninja and if they want to hear more stories about them. And then the book properly ends with a glossary going over some little bits of information surrounding each of the characters, which is something that I do think is honestly pretty cool. And overall, when it comes to this book, I think it is honestly pretty solid, all things considered. I think that for the most part, we do get some genuinely really good stories from this book. Again, Kai's being the one exception. But overall, the rest of the stories I think are genuinely really good, and I feel like they're able to expand on the characters in a genuinely really great way that makes sense for who they are. When it comes to Zane, again, we see him overcoming his trauma associated with being the Ice Emperor and realizing that he was still a good person despite all the stuff that he did as the Ice Emperor. We see that when it comes to Cole, he doesn't always have to push himself and he realizes it's okay to rely on others. And when it comes to Jay, we see him reflecting on things when it comes to his parents and ultimately realizing that he still has a family even if he never really knew his biological one. It's something that I do think is honestly pretty solid. If I were to rank these stories, it would definitely end up going Zane as the best, then Jay, then Cole, then Kai. Overall, again, for the most part, I think these stories are pretty good, again, except for Kai's, but overall, I think it is really great. Although, again, like I said when I talked about the Zane section, I do think it is a real shame that these stories are relegated to just being in this book, because, again, not everyone is going to know about this stuff. I do think it would have been interesting if, at the very least, we saw this in the show in some way, whether through flashbacks or even some shorts that were released online, just anything. But I do like the fact that at the very least we have these stories in general. And overall, I would say that Quest for the Lost Powers is honestly pretty solid. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below, what do you guys think? Tell me what are your guys' thoughts on Quest for the Lost Powers, and was there anything that I left out? Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.